My parents did not love me when I got married. They didn't come to my wedding or support me. They justified this by saying they gave all their assets to my sister, claiming she is better than me. Growing up, James felt like an outsider in his own family. As the oldest child, he had hoped for a certain level of responsibility and respect, but instead, he felt constantly overlooked. His parents, Laura and Tom, adored his younger sister, Emily, with an affection that was painfully obvious to James. Emily was 4 years younger and, according to everyone around them, was simply extraordinary. Her curls, her soft voice, her charm. Everything about her seemed to captivate his parents in ways James couldn't understand. James remembered one time he scored the highest mark in his math class. It was a big deal. He'd stayed up late for weeks preparing, dedicating every spare moment to ensure he didn't miss a single problem on the test. He rushed home, excited to share the news with his family. Laura was at the kitchen table, helping Emily with her school project, while Tom read the paper nearby. "Mom, Dad, I got a perfect score on my math test," he announced, unable to contain his pride. Laura looked up briefly, offering a quick, "That's nice, honey," before turning her attention back to Emily. Tom didn't even look up from his newspaper. Emily, who was crafting a cardboard diorama for a third-grade science project, suddenly exclaimed, "Look, Mommy, I made a volcano." That was all it took. Laura and Tom were instantly engrossed, showering Emily with praises about her talent and creativity, leaving James standing there, his accomplishment unacknowledged. Over the years, these incidents piled up. When James joined the school soccer team and scored his first goal, his parents missed the game to take Emily to a dance recital. When he won an award in science, they only asked if Emily could join next year. No matter what he did, it felt insignificant compared to Emily's smallest achievements. The situation grew worse around birthdays. On James's 16th birthday, he expected a family dinner, maybe even a small celebration with a cake, something to mark the milestone. Instead, he came home to find that his parents had spent the entire day preparing for Emily's upcoming dance competition. There was no cake, no dinner, nothing. When he asked about it, Laura just sighed. "James, honey, Emily's competition is very important to her. We thought you'd understand." But the next week, on Emily's 12th birthday, the house was transformed. Balloons, a custom-made cake, and a backyard party with all her friends. They even hired a magician. James watched from the sidelines, hurt and angry, as his parents lavished attention on Emily, acting as if he wasn't even there. One day, after years of feeling sidelined, James tried to confront his parents. He found them in the living room, watching Emily practice her dance routine. Mustering his courage, he said, "Mom, Dad, can we talk?" Laura glanced at him, but her attention quickly shifted back to Emily. "What's on your mind, James?" she asked absent-mindedly. "I just feel like you don't notice me as much as Emily. Like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Tom sighed, barely hiding his annoyance. "James, your sister has a special talent. We just want to make sure she has every opportunity to develop it. You're a good kid. You don't need as much attention." Good kid. It felt like a slap. James didn't need as much attention? Did they think he didn't have dreams, goals, or desires? By the time James graduated from high school, the favoritism had become an open wound. He had worked hard, making it into the top 10% of his class, earning a partial scholarship to a good college. Graduation day was supposed to be a proud moment, but true to form, his parents had other priorities. Emily had a regional dance competition that day, and they opted to attend it instead. Standing in his cap and gown, James scanned the audience for familiar faces, but his family was nowhere in sight. After the ceremony, he watched other graduates celebrating with their families, receiving hugs, flowers, and congratulations. The emptiness he felt was overwhelming. That night, he came home to a quiet house. There was no acknowledgement of his graduation, no card, no celebratory dinner. All that greeted him was a message from Laura. "We'll catch up tomorrow, sweetie. Emily was fantastic today." He finally realized how deeply their favoritism ran. It wasn't that they simply favored Emily. It was as if he didn't matter at all. College became James's escape. Away from his family, he felt free for the first time. He made friends who respected him for who he was, achieved success on his own terms, and for once, his accomplishments weren't overshadowed by anyone else. He found himself wondering why he even tried so hard to win his family's approval in the first place. The summer after his sophomore year, he went home, hoping maybe things had changed. But the moment he walked in, he saw Emily's awards and trophies displayed prominently in the living room, more numerous than ever. His own academic awards were nowhere to be seen. During a family dinner, Laura announced proudly, "Emily has been accepted into the State Ballet Academy. Isn't that wonderful?" Everyone at the table turned to congratulate her, including Tom, who seemed even more excited than Emily herself. Trying to join in the conversation, James mentioned his own recent academic achievements. "I made the dean's list last semester." Laura's response was dismissive. "That's nice, dear. Now, Emily, tell us about the Academy's program." James felt something inside him snap. It was like they'd pushed him too far, and all he wanted now was to be heard, to have them see the pain they'd caused. He interrupted, something he'd never done before. "Do you even care that I exist?" His voice was steady, but the frustration and anger were unmistakable. The room went silent. Emily looked down, visibly uncomfortable, but Laura and Tom simply looked shocked, as if they couldn't fathom why he'd say such a thing. "James," Tom finally said, "don't be so dramatic. We love you. It's just that Emily needs more support." "Needs more support?" James's voice rose. "I've been ignored my whole life. Everything has been about Emily, as if she's the only one who matters. You've never celebrated a single thing I've done. Not my graduation, not my grades, nothing." Laura shook her head, visibly upset. "James, you don't understand. You're independent. Emily, she needs us more." That was the last straw. James stood up from the table, his heart pounding with years of suppressed resentment. "Fine. If you don't need me, maybe I don't need you either." He walked out, ignoring the shocked calls of his parents behind him. That night, he packed his things and decided he wouldn't come back. James returned to college, vowing to leave the hurt of his family behind. He focused on his studies, joined clubs, and worked part-time jobs. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was building something for himself, something that no one could take away. Each success, each achievement, was his own, and he didn't need anyone's approval to make it meaningful. Yet, the scars of his family's favoritism didn't heal easily. He often found himself wondering if they'd even noticed his absence. Holidays passed without a single call or text from his family, reinforcing his belief that they'd always see him as less important than Emily. But despite the pain, James thrived. His grades remained strong, and he earned a full scholarship by his senior year. His friends became his new family, offering the support he'd never had at home. And when he finally graduated, his friends were there cheering, celebrating him in a way his parents never did. For the first time, James felt genuinely happy. He had created his own life, free from the shadow of favoritism, free to be whoever he wanted. James had long since felt the widening chasm between himself and his family. The steady stream of indifference from his parents, Laura and Tom, had eroded any sense of connection, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own home. No matter how hard he tried, it seemed they barely noticed he existed. His achievements, once a source of pride and effort, became a painful reminder of his family's lack of interest. The distance became impossible to ignore during his high school years. James was a diligent student, putting in extra hours of study, joining clubs, and working part-time. He dreamed that each small achievement might finally spark a bit of pride in his parents. But each time he shared a success, they either brushed it off or shifted the conversation back to Emily. He vividly remembered one particular incident during sophomore year. He had just received the highest grade in his biology class on a challenging project, a project that had kept him up countless nights researching, writing, and revising. This time, he had hope. He'd finally done something that couldn't be dismissed. That evening, he waited for his parents to finish dinner. Once they seemed settled, he gathered his courage. "Mom, Dad, I wanted to share something with you." He could feel his voice trembling, but he pushed forward. "I got the top grade in my biology class. My teacher said my project was one of the best she'd seen in years." Laura looked up briefly, a hint of confusion in her eyes, as though she wasn't entirely sure why he was interrupting. "That's nice, honey. Good job." She returned to her dinner, cutting her meat without so much as a second glance at him. And then Tom chimed in, but not with congratulations. "James, don't you think it's time to look into activities outside academics? Emily has her dance, and she's performing in the county recital next month. Maybe it's time you find a hobby too. It'll be good for you." James sat there, stunned, watching his parents completely gloss over his achievement and steer the conversation back to Emily's upcoming recital. The weight of their disregard settled heavily on him. For a moment, he contemplated arguing, asking them why they couldn't just say they were proud of him, but he knew it would only lead to an awkward silence. So, he did what he always did. He swallowed his disappointment and nodded. From that point on, James began retreating further into himself. If his achievements didn't matter, why bother sharing them? He avoided bringing up his grades, keeping the certificates he earned hidden in a drawer rather than placing them in the family room like Emily's dance trophies. He spent more time alone in his room, immersing himself in his studies, a silent protest that no one seemed to notice. When he joined the debate team in his junior year, he told himself it wasn't for his parents, it was for him. His school's team was competitive, and debates became a way to channel his frustration. He worked hard, staying after school to practice arguments, meticulously crafting his points. In his first debate competition, James won first place. His teacher handed him a certificate with his name printed proudly across the top. On his way home, clutching the certificate, he felt a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this win would mean something to his parents. After all, it wasn't every day that someone came first in a school-wide competition. He entered the house, looking for any sign that his parents might be willing to listen. Laura was helping Emily with her makeup in the living room. It was, dressed as a historical figure, day at school, and Emily was going as Cleopatra. James watched as his mother carefully applied eyeliner, and his father, who was rarely involved in such moments, stood nearby with a camera, ready to capture every second. James cleared his throat, holding up the certificate. "I won my debate competition today. First place." Laura glanced over, her eyes barely pausing on the certificate before she returned her attention to Emily. "That's great, James," she said, almost as an afterthought, before asking Emily to turn her face for a better angle. Tom didn't even acknowledge him. Something shattered inside James. This was the moment he knew his family's attention would always be focused on Emily. No amount of winning, studying, or working could change that. From then on, James's isolation grew. He stopped trying to engage with his parents altogether. At school, his friends became his only source of encouragement, and his teachers were the only adults who praised his efforts. His home became a place he merely slept and ate, an empty shell where he felt more like a ghost than a son. When senior year rolled around, James excelled academically, securing top grades across his classes. His counselor encouraged him to apply to several prestigious colleges. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life away from his family, a place where his accomplishments might actually be recognized. He spent hours filling out applications, carefully crafting essays, pouring his heart into each one, dreaming of a future where he was more than just Emily's older brother. The months went by, and soon the acceptance letters started coming in. James had been accepted into a reputable university on a partial scholarship. The day he received the letter, he walked into the kitchen, where Laura was on the phone with her sister, gushing about Emily's latest dance recital. When Laura hung up, James said quietly, "Mom, I got accepted to State University." Laura looked up, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's nice, James. It's good to have options." And then, almost immediately, she launched into a story about Emily's plans for her next recital. That evening, James sat in his room, acceptance letter in hand, wondering if his parents even cared about his future. It was Emily's senior recital night, and the whole family had gone to see her perform. James decided not to attend. He'd gone to every one of her previous recitals, sitting in the audience and clapping along with everyone else, but tonight, he couldn't bear it. He stayed home, alone, feeling as though he'd already left. As his family returned from the recital, they didn't ask him why he hadn't gone. They didn't even seem to notice he'd been absent. Tom came in, recounting Emily's stunning performance with an enthusiasm James had never heard him use toward any of James's accomplishments. Laura agreed, describing the applause Emily had received, comparing her to a young star. For James, it was the final confirmation of his place in the family. As much as he wanted to belong, he would never be their priority. Their world revolved around Emily, and there was nothing he could do to change that. The months leading up to his departure for college were bittersweet. He was excited for the independence that awaited him, yet a part of him still longed for a connection with his family. When the time finally came for him to leave, he hoped that maybe, just maybe, his parents would realize what they were losing. But when he announced his departure date, their response was lukewarm. Laura asked if he would be able to come back for Emily's big recital in October, as though that was the only reason his absence mattered. Tom reminded him to send his address, but his tone lacked any real emotion. The day he left, they said their goodbyes in the living room. Laura gave him a quick hug, telling him to work hard and do his best, while Tom shook his hand, offering a few polite words about growing up and being responsible. Emily waved absent-mindedly, already talking about her next dance performance. James walked out the door, his heart heavy with a mixture of relief and sadness. It felt more like he was closing a chapter than starting a new one. He knew he wouldn't miss their indifference, but he couldn't help but feel the loss of the family he'd always hoped for but never had. College offered James the fresh start he'd longed for. Here, he could finally be himself without the constant shadow of comparison. He made friends who celebrated his successes, professors who acknowledged his hard work, and for the first time in his life, he felt valued for who he was. Yet, despite his newfound freedom, the scars from his family's neglect lingered. When he received the Dean's List Award, he thought about calling his parents but stopped himself. What would they say? Would they even care? As the years passed, James built a life of his own, surrounded by people who saw and appreciated him. But no matter how much he thrived, a small part of him would always wonder why his family couldn't see the same value in him. When James left for university, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time, he was surrounded by people who knew nothing of his family, who hadn't already cast him into the shadows for someone else. He'd received a scholarship, partly for his academic record and partly for an essay he wrote about resilience, a piece that, without mentioning names, had been rooted in years of feeling overlooked and undervalued. He hadn't expected anyone to care, but they did, and now he was here, alone in his dorm room, relishing the silence and the sense of belonging that had come with his acceptance letter. James quickly adjusted to university life. His roommate, Ben, was an outgoing, curious business major with a knack for making friends instantly. Unlike James, Ben came from a large, close-knit family and spent hours on the phone with his siblings, sharing stories and laughing. Despite their differences, the two became friends almost immediately. Ben introduced James to his circle, a mix of students from different programs, each with unique interests and personalities. One of those friends was Claire, a psychology major with a blunt sense of humor and a fierce loyalty to her friends. Claire's background couldn't have been more different from James's. She was the youngest of 5 siblings, all of whom she claimed would throw down for each other. Her stories of their family dynamics were both chaotic and heartwarming, and she often teased James about his reserved nature, nudging him to open up more. Claire quickly became a close friend, and the two would spend hours studying together in the library or grabbing late-night coffee to talk about their dreams and ambitions. For the first time, James had friends who genuinely celebrated his achievements, no matter how small. When he aced his first midterm, Ben and Claire surprised him with a small gathering in their dorm room, complete with a cupcake and a candle. He'd laughed at the simplicity of it, feeling a mix of surprise and joy at being acknowledged in a way he'd never experienced before. Ben clapped him on the back, saying, "Man, you're going places." And though it was a simple statement, it meant the world to James. As he settled into university, his contact with his family grew more infrequent and formal. He would occasionally send a text to his mother, letting her know he was doing well, or send an email to his father about his grades. Their replies were polite but distant, often veering into updates about Emily's accomplishments and performances rather than any real interest in his life. The first time he went back for a short visit during a holiday break, It became painfully clear that his place in the family was still secondary. One night, while at home, James overheard his parents discussing Emily's recent acceptance into a prestigious dance program. The excitement in their voices was palpable. Laura had said, "This is such a great opportunity for her. We always knew she was special." Tom agreed, adding, "It's good she has something that sets her apart." The words stung, reinforcing that nothing James had achieved seemed to set him apart in their eyes. It was a bitter confirmation of why he distanced himself. Returning to college felt like coming home. His friends welcomed him back with genuine interest in his break, and they spent hours catching up. As classes resumed, James threw himself into his studies with a newfound motivation. He excelled in his courses, his professors taking notice of his work ethic and diligence. One professor in particular, Dr. Edwards, became something of a mentor to him. Dr. Edwards was a respected figure in the biology department, known for his demanding coursework, but also for his encouragement of students who showed potential. After one particularly challenging lab assignment, he called James to his office. "James, I've been impressed with your work this semester," Dr. Edwards said, leaning back in his chair. "Have you considered research opportunities?" The question caught James off guard. He'd never considered research. It felt like something for students with unwavering support and guidance. But here was someone who believed in his abilities, offering him an opportunity purely based on his merits. After a brief pause, James responded, "I hadn't thought about it, but I'd definitely be interested." Dr. Edwards smiled. "Excellent. I think you'll find it both challenging and rewarding. You have the kind of resilience that's invaluable in this field." The conversation left James feeling elated. He joined a research group, working late nights in the lab, diving into the work with a sense of purpose. The research team became a close-knit group, bonding over shared goals and long hours. Sarah, a graduate student in the team, often joked that they were like a second family. For James, that sentiment was closer to the truth than she realized. As months went by, James's connection with his family continued to fade. During a rare phone call with his mother, she mentioned how well Emily was doing in her new program. When James mentioned his research position, Laura responded with a short, "Oh, that sounds nice," before pivoting back to Emily's accomplishments. He found himself saying less and less, his own life becoming a mystery to his family. One evening, James received an email from his father with the subject line, "Important news." For a brief moment, he hoped it might be something personal, maybe even a message of pride in his achievements. But when he opened it, it was an invitation to Emily's next big performance, accompanied by a note asking if he could make it. No mention of his life or his progress at university, just another reminder that, to his family, he remained on the sidelines. By the end of his second year, James had found a place at university that felt like home. He'd earned a reputation as a hardworking and dedicated student, and his friends were more like family than anyone he'd grown up with. Claire, who had become his closest confidant, was the one who suggested he stay on campus during the summer break rather than going home. "You have everything you need here," she'd said. "Why go back to a place that doesn't appreciate you?" Her words resonated with him, and he decided to take her advice. That summer, he focused on his research and spent his free time exploring the city with Claire and Ben. They went to local festivals, tried new foods, and spent late nights talking about life and the future. It was during one of these conversations that James shared the full extent of his family's neglect. Claire listened intently, her expression a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "James, you deserve better. You're worth more than their approval." Her words struck a chord in him. For so long, he had measured his worth by his family's validation, but now he was starting to see himself through the eyes of those who valued him for who he was. He realized he didn't need his family's approval to feel accomplished. The following academic year, James took on more responsibilities within his research team. He presented his work at a university conference, where he received positive feedback from peers and professors alike. Dr. Edwards commended him for his dedication and suggested he consider publishing his findings. For James, this was the culmination of years of hard work and determination. One evening, while studying in the library, James received a text from his father. It was a simple, formal message congratulating him on his presentation. The text was polite but cold, as if it had been written out of obligation rather than pride. He responded with a brief thank you, but felt no desire to continue the conversation. The relationship had become little more than a formality. As graduation approached, James's life was filled with plans and excitement. He received multiple job offers and even considered continuing his research in a graduate program. His friends organized a small celebration, a night filled with laughter and genuine joy. At one point during the night, Claire raised her glass, saying, "To James, who finally found his place." In that moment, James realized he had, indeed, found his place. Away from the shadows of his family's indifference, he had carved out a life filled with respect, recognition, and love. The wounds from his past still existed, but they no longer defined him. James had been with Rachel for nearly 3 years by the time he proposed. They met through mutual friends during his junior year at college, and from their first conversation, James felt a sense of ease he hadn't known before. Rachel was supportive, ambitious, and understood his family dynamics without judgment or pity. She'd come from a family where everyone was valued, but she didn't pity James or feel the need to fix him. She simply loved him for who he was. For James, it was something profound, acceptance and love without conditions, something he had never experienced. Rachel was everything he'd hoped for in a partner. She was a lawyer, fiercely intelligent, with a compassion that made her both respected in her field and beloved by her friends. Her family was as warm as she was. They welcomed James with open arms, and for the first time, he experienced what it was like to be embraced by a family that genuinely cared. They asked about his life, his dreams, his past. They even sympathized when he awkwardly tried to explain his relationship with his own family without revealing too much. Her parents, especially her mother, Barbara, took to James immediately, often calling him just to chat or share a recipe. Barbara made it clear that James was like a son to her, and it warmed a part of him he thought had long since frozen over. When James proposed, Rachel's family was ecstatic. Her parents began discussing wedding plans with him almost immediately, offering both support and enthusiasm. Barbara even joked, "We're going to make this the wedding of the century." James was swept up in the warmth and love they showed, an overwhelming contrast to what he'd known with his own family. As the weeks went on, James and Rachel carefully planned how they'd break the news to his family. He harbored a hope, a faint glimmer that maybe this announcement would spark something in them, that maybe this time they'd be genuinely happy for him. He prepared himself to make the announcement with cautious optimism, even though Rachel warned him gently not to expect too much. "Just be ready for anything," she said softly, holding his hand. "But whatever they say, remember, we have everything we need right here." They decided to visit his parents' house for the announcement. It had been a few months since he'd last seen them. His visits had dwindled over the years, becoming fewer and more strained. When he arrived with Rachel, his mother, Laura, greeted them with a reserved smile, while his father, Tom, gave him a quick nod and returned to his newspaper. Emily wasn't there. She was on her honeymoon in Europe, an extravagant trip that his parents had helped fund, though James hadn't been invited to the wedding. After a few minutes of polite conversation, James took a deep breath and decided it was time. He held Rachel's hand tightly, glanced at her reassuring smile, and then looked at his parents. "Mom, Dad, Rachel and I are engaged." There was a pause. James had braced himself for it, but the silence seemed to stretch forever. Laura's smile barely changed. She looked at him, nodded, and said, "Oh, well, congratulations, honey."
That's nice.
She glanced at Rachel with a polite but detached smile, then quickly shifted her gaze back to her son. "When were you thinking about having the wedding?" Rachel, sensing the lack of warmth, answered, "We're hoping for a spring wedding next year. We want something simple and intimate." Tom merely grunted, glancing briefly in their direction before returning to his paper. It was Laura who continued, "I suppose we'll try to be there if we're not too busy with Emily's schedule." James felt his stomach twist. "We were hoping you'd be involved," he said, trying to keep his tone steady. "It would mean a lot if you could help us out, maybe even just a little bit financially. We're trying to plan something modest, but any support would be appreciated." Laura's response was instant. She sighed and said, "James, I thought you knew. We just can't afford that right now. We helped Emily with her wedding, and it took a lot out of our savings. You understand." right? You're independent. You've always been so capable. Her words felt like a slap, an echo of every dismissal he'd endured growing up. She went on, "You know how much Emily needed our help, especially with her career. And weddings are so expensive these days." James felt a surge of anger, frustration boiling under the surface. He took a slow breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "So, you're telling me that you can't contribute anything? Not even a little?" Tom finally looked up, annoyed. "James, we did what we could for your sister because she needed it. She's the one with the real potential, and we wanted to support her the way parents should. You've always managed on your own." The words struck James like a physical blow. "Managed on my own," he repeated, his voice thick with hurt. "Is that all I am to you? Just someone who can manage, while Emily gets everything handed to her?" Laura's face tightened, a hint of irritation seeping into her expression. "James, you're making a scene. This isn't necessary. We're proud of you, but you don't need us like Emily does." Rachel squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of support as he struggled to hold back the tide of anger and betrayal that surged through him. "You know what, Mom, Dad," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This was the last time. I've spent my whole life being your afterthought, the one you think doesn't need support or love. I've tried so hard to make you see me, to make you proud, but it's clear nothing I do will ever be enough." Tom rolled his eyes. "James, don't be so dramatic." That was it. The final insult. James felt his composure snap. "Dramatic? You have no idea what it's like to be ignored, belittled, and cast aside by your own family." He stood, pulling Rachel up with him. "We don't need anything from you. We have everything we need without your help." Laura looked at him, her expression both stunned and annoyed. "Well, if that's how you feel, maybe it's best you focus on your own life and let us handle ours." James nodded, feeling an overwhelming sense of liberation mixed with sadness. "Yes, maybe that's for the best." He turned and walked out, holding Rachel's hand tightly as they left the house. For the first time, he felt a profound sense of finality. He had tried everything. He had given them countless chances to be a part of his life, to support him, to show him the love he'd craved. But now he saw it clearly. They were never going to change. When he got back to their apartment, James was quiet, lost in thought. Rachel sat next to him, wrapping him in a comforting embrace. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "You stood up for yourself. That takes strength." James nodded, feeling a mix of relief and heartbreak. "I just don't understand how they could not care." Rachel pulled him closer, letting him process the weight of his decision. "Sometimes, family isn't defined by blood, James. You have people who love you, who value you, and I'm one of them." In the following weeks, the absence of his family's presence in his life became both a void and a relief. He hadn't realized just how much energy he'd spent trying to win their approval, hoping for a validation that would never come. Now, as he focused on planning his wedding with Rachel and moving forward with his life, he felt a freedom he'd never known before. Barbara and her husband, Rachel's parents, embraced James with an even stronger sense of love and commitment after learning about his family's reaction. They offered to help with the wedding expenses and became deeply involved in the planning, something that filled the void left by his own parents' indifference. Barbara would often send him excited texts about flower arrangements, venues, and catering options, and her enthusiasm made him feel like he truly belonged. One evening, Barbara invited him over for dinner and handed him a small, beautifully wrapped box. Inside was an heirloom family ring, passed down through generations. "I know it's usually given by blood," she said gently, "but you are as much a part of our family as anyone. We want you to feel that." James was moved to tears. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes about the love and acceptance he'd found with Rachel's family. Rachel and James's wedding day was everything he had ever dreamed of. Surrounded by friends and family, his chosen family, he felt a sense of joy and peace that he never thought possible. As he stood at the altar with Rachel, he looked out at the faces of those who truly loved him, who valued him for who he was. There were no empty seats for his parents or Emily. He hadn't even sent them an invitation. That chapter of his life was closed. After the ceremony, Barbara hugged him tightly. "Welcome to the family, James," she said, her eyes brimming with pride. "We love you, and we're so proud of the man you are." James smiled, a true, heartfelt smile. For the first time, he felt truly seen and valued, not as someone's afterthought, but as a person worthy of love and respect. In that moment, he knew he had finally found where he belonged. When James and Rachel started planning their wedding, they envisioned a day filled with joy, authenticity, and the warmth of true connections. After the painful encounter with his parents, James knew he couldn't include them in this day. The decision to exclude his family wasn't easy, but it felt right. There would be no forced smiles, no hollow congratulations, just genuine support from people who valued him and his happiness. When he shared his decision with Rachel, she wrapped him in a reassuring embrace and simply said, "It's our day, and we deserve only happiness,